So today, my sister's like group cleaning thing, but in the garage where I have no air and then like mostly no light, like the light just like goes out. Well, also, I had hired someone to or a company to um because in my cleaning I had enough clean to not be completely humiliating, although enough to come and I've been having that dishwasher sitting in that box for, like 100 years. So they did that on took out the old one. Of course, the old one I have to figure out how to dispose of now. I think having to schedule a pickup, and of course, tomorrow is when they come, but it doesn't have enough time to schedule, I don't think so. Um, so then I had them also look at the disposal, and they were able to vacuum out the hi. I'm trying to just make sure I lace these like tight today. So I put the that tutu ballerina thing in the donation box. I'm gonna do this one. I have this one in purple tonight. um, so I'm just double knotting my boots so they don't come untied. I think it was only this one, but either way. Uh I believe our pickup tonight. Um, she had like her first kiss and then immediately found out her dad is gay. Ew. Can you tie my boots? Well, actually, I think they're pretty easy to tie. See, um, just didn't occur to me last night in the rush that I should make sure that they're nice and tight. So I'm doing it now. What a day. I don't have a number on how many like drawers I have in the garage or whatever going, but I um I did like more and more like one at a time. And I think I was gonna count it in the end, but like my brain like forgot how to count by that point and it ran like an hour later. Oh, but anyway, progress. Your girl had progress. Okay. Um, and now I can relax and read it to you. Got two coffees over there because I'm thirsty as hell after being in that garage. Whew. Pulling you up. By the way, this is where we're at. Page 284. This is what we've read except this page. And this is what we have left to go. Mm. Mm. Okay, I am here. Okay. She woke up early. The sun had barely risen. Only a faint gray light filtered through the curtains she had drawn the night before. She had fallen asleep sometime in the early hours of the morning and slept fitfully, startling awake several times, dreaming repeatedly of someone opening the door to her room, dreaming of David. She did not remember at first what happened the night before, and when she did, two emotions overtook her. The first was a deep and profound sadness at the realization that perhaps what Gregory said had been true. She was not sad about the possibility of its truth. In fact, she had considered the idea herself, without knowing exactly what she was considering, but about what it meant if Gregory knew this about her father and she did not. It was another stone on the pile of David's many half-truths and deceptions. Worse, it meant that David, presumably, had been open with others, with Liston, with everyone at the lab, but never with her. The gravity of this was too large for her, too overwhelming. She tucked it away. The second emotion, the more immediate, was a slow, terrible shame. She put her hands to her face. She did not know how she could ever be in the same room as William Liston again, how she could ever look at him. Worst of all, she had no one to tell. Normally, discussions about minor and major romances dominated every lunchtime conversation with Melanie and Teresa and the others. For the first time, she had something to contribute, and she could never tell a soul, nor could she, for obvious reasons, and Gregory already knew and probably hated her for it. Only Lisa Grady remained, but good virginal Lisa Grady, her equal only yesterday, wouldn't understand it. She would blink severely in Ada's direction, raise her eyebrows, lower the corners of her mouth. She would think less of her. Ada would tell no one. She rose and dressed as quietly as she could. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. The library would not be open that day. She couldn't go back to Liston's. She couldn't stay at David's house. It would be the first place Liston would think to look when she woke up and found Ada missing. She picked up her blue parka from its place on the floor and put it on. It smelled like William had. She closed her eyes tightly against the moments that replayed in her mind. William's hand, William's mouth, the places he touched. Her stomach hurt. She clenched it. In the hallway, she passed David's room and considered going to St. Andrew's to see him, but that too felt unsafe. She no longer knew who he was. She walked down the stairs and into David's office and took down from a shelf a small stack of yellow phone books. She flipped through the largest one until she found the entry she was looking for and wrote down a telephone number and an address. Then she walked out the kitchen door, locking it behind her. A frost had settled over everything and made the ground hard and unforgiving. Ada walked toward the Savin Hill Bridge, her hands in her pockets. She should have dressed more warmly, thick socks and long underwear. David was a firm believer in long underwear. She thought again of what Gregory had said, and a series of memories presented themselves to her. The first was David's fascination with certain men, though she reasoned he had also seemed fascinated by women. Liston, for example, Miss Holmes, several of their neighbors over the years. The second was the way he spoke about President Pierce, who himself was gay, always with a sort of reverence, respect for his long-standing relationship with his partner, Jack Greer, another brave and Brahmin Bostonian, an attorney whose career necessitated in those days discretion. It was true. David had never had a girlfriend, never had anything close to a girlfriend. Also true was the fact that he had used a surrogate for Ada. Why had she never considered the reasons for this before? And why, if he was gay, had he never said a word to her about it? In 1985, Ada knew what the word gay meant. The AIDS epidemic was in the first years of its full deadly swing throughout the community, and she had read enough in the papers to understand its seriousness, but had seemed an abstract that had seemed an abstract thing to her. At 14, she had the cocky sense of indestructibility that all teenagers have, and until the onset of her father's Alzheimer's and his subsequent decline, she had somehow assumed David to be surrounded by the same bubble of immortality. Her brushes with religious feeling had lent her the sense that maybe there was a larger plan for her, and if there was, it certainly could not include her own death or the death of the person she loved most in the world. She clung to this belief to ward off the worry that at certain moments seemed as if it might overtake her completely, might possess and operate her body like a purgatorial soul. This denial, then, this inability to fully contemplate what she found unsettling, had prevented her from ever fully confronting the question of David's sexuality. And now she berated herself for it. The look of shock that must have crossed her face when Gregory spat those words at her. She wished now that she had had a tool and even reply at the ready. Of course, I knew that, or better, and a single word, and as if to imply that she was bored already with the subject. On Sunday mornings, while the rest of the neighborhood was at church, sometimes David and she had gone to breakfast at a neighborhood diner on the other side of the bridge, with a waitress David liked named Dee Dee, who knew Liston from the neighborhood as well. To kill time, Ada walked there now. She had $10 in the little wallet she carried in the inside pocket of her jacket. Since she'd been living with Liston, she had received the same allowance Liston gave her sons of $5 a week. Payment for work completed, Liston always said, not allowance, which she very rarely spent. The diner was surprisingly crowded. It was warm and close inside and smelled of fat and bread and coffee, and below that, cigarette smoke, both stale and fresh. Ada didn't recognize the hostess, and Dee Dee was not there. She sat at the counter and ordered David's favorite, the lumberjack special, with eggs and bacon and home fries and toast and a short stack of pancakes on the side. Hungry, huh? Asked the line cook teasingly, and Ada agreed that she was. He put a black coffee in front of her. David drank coffee regularly, always with whole milk, but Ada did not like it. Still, she took a sip of it tentatively, and then a longer one. It felt right somehow to drink it. Adult. She thought of William's mouth on hers and closed her eyes tightly against the memory. It was nice to be out someplace warm and new by herself, away from David's house, away from all the Listons. She sat at the counter for 2 hours, reading a newspaper, avoiding the line cook's eye. She ate every bite of her breakfast and asked for another coffee. Finally, she stood up and paid at the counter, and then she consulted the piece of paper on which she had written the address from David's yellow pages. She had not wanted to get there too early, but she supposed that 9:30 was a reasonable hour. Then she walked over to Dot Ave and walked south toward Ashma. Oh, hi, John. Are they still showing screenings of Grease? I think they're doing Gone with the Wind again this year. Ashmont was where Miss Holmes lived. She had told Ada once that she rented an apartment on the top floor of a triple-decker, and Ada imagined her life there to be quiet and warm and enviable, with potted plants and a little deck outside. She imagined that Miss Holmes made tea for herself and cooked small meals and froze what was left over. Miss Holmes had said nothing that might lead her toward a particular vision of her life at home, but Ada knew that this was the sort of life she could imagine having herself one day, and so she chose to believe it about Miss Holmes. When she reached Miss Holmes's street, she turned onto it and walked resolutely to number 33. Three bells formed a little stoplight by the door, and before she could be scared, she pushed the top one, and while she waited, it began to snow. She held her breath and said a prayer, briefly, that Miss Holmes would answer. The library was closed. There were not many other places to go. She could not go back to Liston's, not yet. She looked up at the white sky and counted slowly to 10, and then she rang the doorbell again. Above her, a window opened, and from it emerged a face that Ada did not recognize. The face was not unfriendly. It belonged to a young woman of indeterminate age, an adult, Ada thought, but the woman was backlit by the bright bank of clouds behind her, and she couldn't be entirely sure. Hello, said the woman. Hi, said Ada. I'm looking for. Is Miss Holmes there? Yeah, said the woman. Can I talk to her for a sec? Said Ada. Sure, said the woman, but she did not move for a moment. And then Miss Holmes herself appeared, leaning out the window alongside the other woman. Ada, she said, surprised, is that you? Miss Holmes's apartment was not unlike how Ada had pictured it. Oriental carpets crisscrossed one another on top of hardwood floors, and the furniture was mismatched and comfortable. Not surprisingly, all of the walls were lined with bookshelves, and all of the bookshelves were filled with books. There were no potted plants, but there was a Christmas tree in the corner, already decorated with little colored lights strung around it in 3 loops. Are you all right? Asked Miss Holmes, upon letting her in. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers. Still, it was funny to see her out of her librarian attire, typically a calf-length skirt and an oversized sweater. I'm fine, said Ada. I was just in your neighborhood. How did Miss Holmes began, but then she shook her head. Welcome, she said. Ada was looking behind Miss Holmes at the other woman in the apartment. She was standing in the corner shyly, a small smile on her face. She was short and plump and brown haired. She worked the knuckles of one hand with the fingers of the other. Miss Holmes followed Ada's gaze. This is my daughter, she said. Constance. Constance, this is Ada. She's a friend. Hey, said Constance, holding up one hand. Ada had not known Miss Holmes had a daughter. Ada had noted long ago, when she was coming in regularly with David, that Miss Holmes wore no wedding ring, but it occurred to her that she had never really asked Miss Holmes anything about herself. Miss Holmes took Ada's coat and hung it on a rack mounted to the wall and draped with dozens of other coats and scarves and jackets. Have a seat, she said, pointing to the sofa. I'll make us tea. Ada sat down. Constance remained standing, avoiding Ada's gaze. She followed her mother with her eyes as Miss Holmes walked into the kitchen. How old was she? It was difficult to tell. She was wearing a red sweatsuit. The top was covered with shiny patchwork hearts. Ada had the sudden feeling that Constance was different. Somehow, that perhaps she belonged to a group of people who could be described by a word that the students at Queen of Angels hurled at one another viciously, with a frequency that had startled Ada at first. It was a word she had heard William and Teresa and Janice. It was a word that seemed to Ada almost as bad as the words that Gregory had used about her father almost two as bad as Lucer, the other word to duck, at Queen of Angels when it was thrown. She had not used any of these words herself. They seemed almost magical in their power to wound, an incantation or a spell. When the silence became uncomfortable, Ada spoke. That's a nice Christmas tree, she said. Thanks, said Constance. She tucked her hair behind her ear. Did you decorate it? We both did, said Constance. She sat down then, across from Ada. Do you have a Christmas tree? She asked tentatively. No, said Ada, not yet. I will, though, she added, to assure herself of this as much as Constance. I love Christmas trees, said Constance. I can't get enough of them, actually. Me neither, said Ada. It was true. She missed having one at Liston's. She hoped that Liston would put one up soon. Through a picture window at one end of the room, Ada could see that the snow was picking up speed. The snowflakes themselves were getting fatter. David's favorite. This is very satisfying now, Ada, he would have said. This is real snow. She closed her eyes briefly against her memories of all the times he woke her up or brought her to the window upon first snowfall. Was it snowing in Quincy, too? Would any kind nurse know how to point him toward the window? Miss Holmes returned with a tray. On it was a teapot and cups, a little cardboard box of cookies, and an envelope that rested against the thumb of her right hand. On the front of it, Ada could make out Miss Anna Holmes and the address of the public library. So, said Miss Holmes, this is a good thing, Ada. Guess what arrived yesterday, she said. She put the tray down and held up the envelope. She had opened it already, and Ada saw on her face that she had been uncertain about how and when to present its contents. I was going to give it to you Monday, said Miss Holmes, but here you are. She poured 3 cups of tea and brought one of them to Ada, along with the envelope. Now, said Miss Holmes, before you open it, I want to warn you that it's strange. Inside the envelope was a letter. December 5th, 1985. Okay, so it's going to be strange. All right. Do you think that's the word? I don't know. Dear Miss Holmes, I hope the enclosed information will be helpful to you. It took me some time and a trip to our city hall, but I did find records of a Kennedy family near Olathe, although there are no living members here today. There were 2 men born in Olathe named Harold Kennedy. The first was born February 13th, 1892. He was married on May 1st, 1912, to Greta Burns, also born in Olathe, 1892. Their first child, Susan Kennedy, was born on July 15th, 1913, but died in 1929 at the age of 15. No mention of cause of death. Harold Kennedy was a minister at the Second Presbyterian Church here. He died in Olathe in 1968, and his wife Greta died in 1974, also in Olathe. Their second child, Harold Kennedy Jr., was born on January 2nd, 1918, and I could find no death record for him in Olathe. However, and this is purely anecdotal, I mentioned the interesting task you've given me to a colleague here at the library, and she knew the Kennedy family. In fact, she went to the church where Harold Kennedy Sr. used to preach, and she told me that after attending college, Harold Jr. went on to work for the civil service in Washington, D.C., and wasn't seen nor heard from again. That is, until the town received word of his death. She believes it was a car accident. This would have been sometime between 1947 and 1952, she thinks. It was just after the war anyway. You might do well to look in the Washington Times Herald or the Post. She remembers this, my colleague here, because she recalls Reverend Kennedy praying about it at church. Terrible thing to lose two children. I hope this is helpful. Please let me know if I can be of further assistance. Sincerely, Fred Coburn, Olaf Public Library. Oh, wow. Okay, our next section here is 1920s to 1930s Kansas. All right. What's wrong, Susan? Said Harold Kennedy. Trying to be brave, though truly he didn't want to know. Years old, he was standing in a sort of shed, a hastily with a sharp, shadowy smell of rust. Shivering, it was early March and very cold. The year was 1929. His sister, Susan, was crying. She was wearing her winter coat, which this year was too small for her. She was sitting on the dirt floor and leaning on the wall. Despite the splinters she was sure to pick up from the rough, unfinished wood, her head was on her arms, which were folded over her knees, and she was weeping. Harold had heard her from outside. That's how he'd known to come in. This shed was where they came, the two of them, to sort things out, and sometimes to avoid their father. Susan was his favorite person. She was 5 years older than he was, raucously funny when she wanted to be, pretty in a round, unstartling way. She had only two dresses. Her father thought that more would encourage vanity, but she took very good care of that. Sewed well, arranged her hair in flattering, mysterious styles. Tell me what's wrong, said Harold again. He was on shaky territory. He tried to guess. Not their father. There had been no incident with him. Not that Harold knew about. He would have heard it. Their house was small, and he was always in it, something Susan sometimes pointed out when she was feeling unkind. Go outside, Harold, for once in your life, she instructed him. It was something with a boy, then, he guessed. There had been several recently hanging around. He had seen Susan with them at school, and once on the main road, too. But when he proposed this, is it a boy? He asked, embarrassed. Susan only shook her head violently, overtaken by her own sobs, drowning in them. It was not quite like seeing an adult cry, not quite, but it was almost as bad. For as long as he could remember, Susan had seemed untouchable, wise, well versed in everything Harold wished to know. She was generally composed, wry, knowing. She laughed loudly, her mouth open. She rarely cried. She protected him when it was important. She was popular at school and made him, if not liked, then tolerated, adopted as a sort of odd mascot. She rolled her eyes impeccably. She gestured with her hands in a way that fascinated Harold, who tried to imitate her until one day his father slapped his hands and told him he looked like a girl when he did that. Harold looked around the shed. There were 6 empty cans of whitewash on a high up shelf. There were 12 bags of diamond chicken feed below them. There were 24 small wooden posts, the start of a set of chairs on the floor. The pattern distracted him. I'm going to have a baby, said Susan. He didn't understand. I'm expecting, said Susan. She still had her head against her arms. Her voice was muffled. Don't you know what expecting is? Harold bristled as he did whenever he felt his intelligence was underestimated. Of course he knew what expecting meant. What he didn't know exactly was how a person got a baby inside her, but he knew that it was not a thing that should happen to a girl of 15, an unmarried girl. He had heard whispers about other girls it had happened to in the past. The youngest parents of his friends, for example, people who got married at Susan's age. Aren't you going to say anything? Susan asked, finally looking up. Her face was frightening, red and wretched, wet with tears. Her hair was matted into a sort of single mass, as if it had been sweating, though it was cold enough in the dim shed to make Harold shiver. Have you told Daddy? Said Harold. I'll never tell him, said Susan, so quickly and viciously that Harold flinched. He'll kill me. Do you understand? He'll actually kill me. And you can't tell him either. Their mother did not enter the conversation. She did what their father said. She rarely made eye contact with either of them, out of shame. Harold thought sometimes, for being unable to protect her children, she had turned off some switch inside herself long before Harold was born. He wondered sometimes what she had been like as a child. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Promise, said Susan, wild-eyed. I promise, said Harold. Swear it, said Susan. I swear it, said Harold. He wanted to ask her what she was going to do, but he had pressed his luck enough. He decided he felt a vague sense of awe that Susan had told him as much as she had. The next day was Sunday, and on Sundays they spent the whole day in church. Susan looked woozy and faint. Harold studied her. Was she bigger? Was her stomach bigger? He couldn't say. She had never been a small girl, and if she looked round her now, it wasn't enough to draw attention. Quit staring, she hissed finally. Their father, from his pulpit, spoke frightening words about damnation. For most of Harold's life, he had seemed like God. The decisiveness with which he cast behaviors and emotions into categories of good and evil, the authority he bore now like a mantle over his, the knack he had for knowing when anyone was lying. He bragged about this final quality. He was proud of it. I'm everywhere, he said to his children. I know everything. And it was also what he said about God. There was no library in their town. The nearest one was in Olath, and sometimes when Mr. Macklin had to go there to visit a friend on a Saturday, he let Harold ride along beside him. He dropped Harold at the Carnegie Building on North Chestnut Street, which offered a surprisingly complete collection of both fiction and reference books. There, Harold spent long hours reading what he could find, including at one point the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, from start to finish, except for volume 12, Gitschel Harmonium, which was missing and therefore acquired added intrigue in Harold's mind. He felt certain that he was being deprived of the most important secrets of the whole endeavor. The Saturday following his sister's announcement, he sought out Mr. Macklin, who, by chance, was heading down, and when he got to the library, he went directly to the reference station section and selected from it volume 22 and searched it for pregnancy, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly and guiltily, but it yielded no results. Volume 3, however, contained within it an entry on birth, which Harold quickly skimmed for useful details. Anything helpful bring back to Susan, like a Labrador with a stick. The best case scenario, he imagined, would be if he could find her a solution that might make the pregnancy go away, just disappear, sort of, unmanifest itself, just as it had manifested itself, mysteriously, darkly, a curse that had befallen his sister. It did not seem to him that a child could be inside her. This was too much of an abstraction. To Harold, he couldn't imagine it. In fact, it made him envious. He didn't like the thought of Susan loving anything more than him. The encyclopedia, unfortunately, was not helpful. Mainly, it discussed the legal aspects of childbirth within the context of British jurisprudence. Unhelpful, Harold decided. Volume 23 was slightly more helpful, for within it was reproduction, a word that Harold knew was vaguely connected to the situation Susan had found herself in, though he could not remember how he had learned this. There were one or two things he thought might be useful, and he wrote down notes on a little scrap of paper he had gotten from the librarian in a code he had invented for himself several years before. He would bring it to Susan and explain to her what he'd learned, but it wasn't much. In general, the language was so technical, so scientific, that he could not connect it to his sister Susan, who was vivid, pained, human. All week she had been wandering to school and back like a ghost. Their father had slapped her the night before hard for not listening, but Harold knew that she had only been distracted, not intentionally disobedient. Harold, his mother had murmured. His father's name was Harold too, but that was all she said. Susan did not put a hand to her face. She did not alter her expression. Instead, there was an odd, forbidding calm about her, as if she had suddenly made up her mind about something. He rode home with Mr. Macklin, who was a kind and entirely silent person, and the owner of one of the few automobiles in their little town, which made him impressive. He had reached the rank of commander in the U.S. Navy during the First World War, thus lending him an authority that surpassed the authority of anyone else in the town. He also attended the church over which Harold's father presided, which was the only reason Harold was allowed to go with him when he was invited. In their small town, Harold was recognized as intelligent, someone who might be going places. This recognition meant, in his father's mind, that Harold had sinned. He was too proud, he told Harold often, not humble enough, but he respected Mr. Macklin and also perhaps Mr. Macklin's donations to the church. So when Harold was invited along, he was allowed to go. Just make sure you're not a nuisance, said his father, each time Mr. Macklin picked him up. Therefore, on their drives together, Harold did not speak, but instead wondered what Mr. Macklin thought about all the silence. He wondered whether whether any member of the congregation had an idea of the dual nature of his father, the Reverend Kennedy. The darkness of him that emerged at home at night, or sometimes in the late afternoon. Could Mr. Macklin, could anyone in the pews on Sundays imagine the sheer, searing terror of being chased by an adult? Had they been chased by their fathers? Had they been beaten? Yes, Harold told himself. Yes, this was a part of childhood. He had heard his friends at school talking about it, resignedly, almost bragging about the beatings they had gotten. Yet he knew that what he received was different, and so he never joined in. When they returned, he thanked Mr. Macklin politely, descended from the vehicle, and walked toward the house. He felt in his pocket for the scrap of paper. Because it was in code, he would have to read it to Susan. He looked forward to it. It would make him feel needed, important. Perhaps she would thank him. But he knew something was wrong as soon as he entered the house. It was 6 o'clock in the afternoon. and his mother was out, and his father was home, sitting at the table, looking dangerous. Harold's first instinct was to retreat to his bedroom, but he had caught the gaze of his father, and there was no leaving without words. His father measured him. "Where's your sister?" he said, lowly. "I don't know," said Harold. "Speak up," said his father. "I don't know, sir," said Harold. "I think you do," said his father. Harold was silent. He waited. "Your mother's out looking for her," said his father. "She was supposed to be back here 3 hours ago to finish her chores." He stood up abruptly from behind the table, and Harold's muscles tightened reflexively. He made himself smaller and firmer. He looked at the floor. "You'll do them instead, I guess," said his father. Harold looked down until his father was gone, out the door, to parts unknown. Only then did he breathe out. In those days, Harold prayed with some frequency, so he said a brief, thoughtless prayer that his sister would not return that night, for he knew what awaited her when she did. Later, when Susan had still not returned, when the house was empty of her at 10 o'clock at midnight, the next morning, when the terrible realization hit him for the first time that she might be gone for good, he tried to take it back. He prayed to undo what he had requested, but he knew, even while he was asking, that it was too late. Everything was worse with Susan gone. His mother stopped speaking almost entirely. Formerly, she had found small outlets in Susan's sometimes outrageous humor, allowing herself to laugh at her daughter's antics whenever her husband was not home. Now, Harold could not raise his mother, even for a moment, out of the lowness that overtook her, and that would last, as far as he knew, for the rest of her life. His father swerved wildly between two poles. One was repentance, loud pleas for first an explanation and then forgiveness, prostration before God, and the other was increased and dangerous violence directed at both Harold and his mother. Harold, he presumed, had been Susan's confidant. "I know already," he had said, "don't lie to me." And in a moment of fear and guilt and shame, Harold had confessed that it was true. What followed was the most profound beating of his life. Several times he thought that he would die. He did not go to school for 2 weeks, waiting for the wounds to heal. Frequently, as an adult, he still felt a pain in his left shoulder, which had popped out of its socket with a sickening thud when his father jerked him back to stop him from running away. The police found her, his sister Susan, exsanguinated in a field near Shawnee. She had been left there by some practitioner of bad medicine, some charlatan. How she had gotten to Shawnee in the first place, what pains she had taken to first learn about the procedure and then to find a ride, would remain a mystery for the rest of Harold's life. He eyed the boys her age at school, looking for a culprit. He had a hunch about one of them, a shadowy boy who rarely spoke, but whom girls loved fiercely, sighed over, fought over. His father did what he could to prevent the story from spreading, but certainly people knew what had really happened. Harold knew too, from eavesdropping them, though his father had sent him out of the room. He had stood out of sight around the corner, despite the risk. There, when the news was delivered, he had stopped himself from crying out by clamping his own hand over his mouth. Later, he had to pretend not to have known in front of his parents when they broke the news to him again. There was such profound horror in both moments that each memory haunted him forever. First, the horror of the revelation. "Bled out," the policeman had said. "Bled out, bled out, bled out." Next, the horror of his father's delivery of this same news, mangled by his terrible face-saving lies. An accident, his father had said, caused by her own disobedience. He had heard people talking about it too at the school. The word abortion was not then used, but he understood in a hazy, childish way what had occurred. At the funeral, which Harold's father himself presided over, revealing perversely, Harold thought, in the attention and sympathy his father had again called her death a tragic accident. He had not elaborated. He had stood at the pulpit, feigning a kind of labored stoicism. For the first time, Harold saw him with a clear, impartial eye. He recognized the narcissism that made his father thrill at the concern, the condolences proffered by his congregation. He recognized that his father's show of grief over Susan mainly stemmed from what people. For a time, he believed Susan would come back. He never saw her body. He had asked to see it, wanting to say goodbye. Only Catholics viewed their dead, said his father, and certainly not that. He had feverish dreams in which she came to him, shrieking in pain, bleeding from every orifice. He had tender dreams in which she put a steady hand on his head, blessing him, and in those dreams he felt the presence of God more clearly than he ever had in his father's church. Her absence made it clear to him that she had been the only tolerable part of his existence. She had teased him warmly, inventively. She had let him know that fun and lightness existed in the world. She had sheltered him from the worst of their father's rages. She had pushed an older boy once for calling him a bad word, pushed him so hard that the boy had taken 2 long steps backwards, saying, "Whoa, whoa." She had been his family. He grew mute and tidy and invisible. He did not speak unless spoken to, not to his parents, not to his friends. It was around this time, 10, 11, 12, that thoughts he had pressed down deeply when he was younger began to spring up, as if they were seeds he had planted early in his life, as if it were now spring. His first thoughts were about 2 of the boys he grew up with. Ignobly, they were the 2 most obvious choices, the best-looking boys in the school. He tried telling himself at first to push these thoughts away again, to bury them permanently. He tried telling himself that these thoughts were evil, but the person who had most emphatically convinced him of that, his father, was, Harold decided, himself the embodiment of the most of the pain and suffering that existed in his world. The logic did not hold. He continued to go to the library with the kind Mr. Macklin, and their mutual silence turned from an embarrassment to a comfort. He read everything. He asked for more from the librarian, specific tomes that he had seen referred to in the Encyclopedia Britannica. At the end of the entries he particularly liked, he read about far-flung places that seemed more civilized to him: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Paris, Rome, Alexandria, California. In his spare time, he worked through every famous math problem that had ever been solved, following the steps that had been taken already when he could not unravel it himself, studying it until he felt he understood. He taught himself well. He counted the days until he could leave home, and he vowed to himself, to Susan, that when he did, he would never return. All right, now we're going back to 1980s Boston. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if Ada will then look like Susan. Her dad is like Turner. Oh, Ike Turner. Yeah, I was it like Ike Turner. Ada paused briefly on Liston's porch, closing her eyes, making a wish that nobody would be home. She had been absent since 11 o'clock the night before, when she snuck past a sleeping Liston on her way into the woods. It was early afternoon now. The next day, she had just left Miss Holmes's apartment, and there was no place else she could think of to go. She did not want to return to David's. Besides, if anyone was looking for her, they would look there first. Would Liston be angry with her for disappearing? Would Liston be inside, pretending nothing had happened, pretending he had not recently changed her entire internal world in a permanent, irreversible way? Worse, would Melanie be by his side? The front door opened. Ada opened her eyes. Gregory stood inside, wearing a t-shirt with an alien on it. He looked contrite. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "Can you come upstairs for a second?" he asked, backing away into the shadows of the house. Ada hesitated. "Just a second," said Gregory, and at last she followed. The rest of the house was quiet. It seemed as if no one was home. In the attic, Gregory was waiting for her, standing there forthrightly, his arms hanging at his sides. "I would like to apologize," he said formally. Ada paused. "Okay," she said. She crossed her arms. "What are you sorry for?" He flushed. He looked down at the floor. "For calling you stupid and for saying that about your father." She did not ask him whether he thought it was true. She knew now, and he knew that it was. "Do you accept my apology?" Gregory asked. "That's not how it works," Ada wanted to say. "You wait and see." Instead, she nodded once. Gregory looked pleased. "It never happened before," said Ada, "in case you were wondering." "Oh," he said. "I don't like him," she said. "About William. You asked me last night if I did. I don't." "It was a mistake," she added, a phrase she had heard only in films. They sat together for a while. Ada felt changed, as if she had crossed a bridge that had collapsed behind her. Suddenly, without warning, Gregory seemed younger to her now. She had left him behind. All day her feelings had swung wildly back and forth. There was a part of her that wished she could return to her childhood, yes, retreat to the opposite shore, but she also had the satisfying sense that she had gained a new and interesting piece of wisdom about the universe, had been granted access to a secret that the adults in her life had known for years. It made her consider all of them with new interest. It made her wonder new things. Miss Holmes had given her the letter from the librarian in Olath to keep. She considered whether or not to share it with Gregory. He had his back to her now. He was playing some sort of primitive game on his computer. Two pixelated machines were scuttling back and forth across the bottom of the screen. "What is it?" she would have said to him. Formerly, she would have asked if she could play. "By the way," he said, "Mom's been looking for you." He didn't turn around. "She has?" said Ada. She had been hoping that, against all odds, Liston simply had not noted her absence. David probably wouldn't have. "Yeah," said Gregory. "She's worried. She's driving around looking for you." "Do you know where she went?" Ada said. "Nope," said Gregory. "She has Maddie with her. She said she was going to call the police if you weren't back when she got back." "Shit," said Ada quietly. "She asked me if I knew where you were," said Gregory after a pause. "Did you tell her?" asked Ada, and a sudden panic hit her that Gregory, before his first wave of anger had subsided, might have told her what he saw. She could not face Liston if he had. Gregory turned around slowly in his chair. He had won the game. He swiped a quick hand under his nose. "No," he said finally. "I didn't tell her anything. I said I thought maybe you just left early and gone for a walk. I don't think she believed me, though." "Thank you," said Ada. Gregory nodded, somewhat formally, once. She decided then that She would show him the letter. He seemed genuinely contrite. Besides, there was no one else to whom she could show it. Look, said Ada to Gregory. She held it forth. He took it and read it, mouthing the words intently, a habit of his that Ada had noted before. Harold Kennedy, he said, looking up. Ada nodded. Miss Holmes says we can research him next. And she was glad, for the first time, to have Gregory alongside her, worrying the same things that she was worrying, working away at the same mystery that she was trying to work out. He was the only person in her life, she realized, who knew everything there was to know about David. Everything that she knew, at least. And he seemed not to judge David, but to think of him somehow as a part of Ada, as a part of Ada did too, with respect, as the creator of a long and interesting riddle for both of them to solve, as a genius, which, despite everything that had transpired, was still the grain of truth about her father that Ada clung to. That gave her some measure of comfort. Liston came home an hour later from the attic. Ada heard her open the front door, and then she heard Liston's low, panicked voice tell Maddie to go to his room for a while. Why? Maddie exclaimed, and Liston tensely said she had some things to take care of. I'm here, called Ada. She walked down the attic stairs and then down the staircase to the first floor, passing Maddie as she went. You're going to be in trouble, Maddie said, raising his eyebrows. I know, Ada said. Ada? Cried Liston. And then there were quick footsteps down the hallway, and at the bottom of the stairs, Liston came into sight, her face slightly crumpled. She was wearing a windbreaker suit and a red winter hat with a pom-pom on it. Red socks knitted in white around its crown. She was wearing her overcoat. It was her formal one, the one she wore to work events in the winter, and it did not match the rest of her clothing. Ada imagined her throwing it on in a hurry, leaving with Maddie in the car, looking for her, for Ada. Oh my God, baby, where have you been? Said Liston quietly. I'm sorry, said Ada. She did not want to tell her. She also did not want to lie. Liston put one hand on the banister. Oh my God, you scared the bejesus out of me, she said. You have to tell me where you were. I'm sorry, said Ada again. I don't think I can. Liston looked at her, considering. I won't do it again, I promise, said Ada. Should I be worried? Asked Liston. No, said Ada. I think I'm going to have to punish you, said Liston, as if the thought was occurring to her for the first time. I know, said Ada. Did David ever punish you? Liston asked. No, said Ada, but you can, she said encouragingly. She didn't watch TV or play Atari. These could be taken away. These could not be taken away. She rarely went to see friends. Grounding wouldn't have made sense. Therefore, the punishment, Liston decided, would be chores. A full cleaning of the kitchen that afternoon and dinner duty every night that week. While she cleaned, Liston sat with her. Are you all right? She said. Her chin was propped on her hand. I've been worried about you for months. I'm not sure, Ada said. I think so. I know you haven't been going to see David, said Liston, and Ada paused. She closed her eyes briefly. Sister Catherine asked me where you'd been. It's okay, said Liston quickly. You have the right to be mad at him. Ada winced. She turned her back to Liston and swept the same spot for too long. In her mouth was the bitter, salty taste of tears, and tears were in her eyes too, and then on her cheeks. She did not want to show them to Liston. She sniffed. She put a shaky hand to her nose, and then she pinched it. Ada, asked Liston, and then suddenly Ada was bent over at the waist, and then she sank down against the refrigerator all the way to the floor, her head on her knees. The broom clattered on the floor beside her. Sobs racked her muscles and her bones. She coughed. It was the first time in her memory that she had ever cried in front of anyone. David had not liked her to cry. Liston sat down on the floor beside her, still in her overcoat, and she put her right arm over Ada's shoulders and bent her head down to Ada's head. They sat like that until the room grew dark. Within a week, Ada had recounted everything there was to know about David to Liston. The story of the scandal in the Sebelius family, the story of the Kennedy family, and Harold Kennedy's apparent death. Gregory knows too, she said. And Liston looked confused but pleased. Oh, she said, have you two been spending time together? And Ada gave a copy of the 4 Ada disc to Liston too. And Liston was now at work on the code, along with the rest of the members of the Steiner lab. They talked about it at lunch, Liston said, with Ada's permission. They had given it to other friends, and friends of friends too. Meanwhile, on weekends, the four of them, Liston, Ada, Gregory, and Maddie, researched Harold Kennedy in Widener Library's massive newspaper archive, to which Liston had access as part of an agreement between Harvard and the BIT. These are my research assistants, she said, straight-faced, to the kind guard who stood just inside the door. They sat there together, the three eldest, bowed over microfilm readers, searching through every issue of the Washington Times Herald from 1947 on for Harold Kennedy's name. Matty did his homework or read comic books patiently, happy to have them all united again. Later, Ada would remember these afternoons as some of the pleasantest ones of her life. It was the quiet of the library, its calmness. She breathed more deeply. Her heart rate slowed. The smell of it, must and mildew and paper, like the smell of David's house, the echoing footfalls of students and librarians and researchers, which gave the place the feeling of a pool or a spa, the beauty of the building, which David always loved. And most of all, the feeling of being a part of a team again, a group of individuals all working together toward the same goal. She had not felt this way since David had been at the helm of the Steiner lab. After their sessions, they went to get a pizza nearby, and Liston asked them all everyday questions about school, about friends, about teachers. She asked them if they wanted to watch TV with her that night and what it was that they wanted to watch. She split up arguments between Gregory and Maddie. She rolled her eyes at Ada conspiratorially, and Ada remembered slowly at first, and then in a warm, intoxicating rush, everything she had ever loved about Liston. Now, with no secrets, there was more to talk about. Now there was music. Sometimes in the evening, the Clancy brothers and Tommy Mackham, or Sam Cooke or Peggy Lee. Now there were Sunday dinners. Mainly, the Liston family did not spend time with William. He was out almost always now with his friends, which included Ada's friends as well. The first time she had seen him after their encounter, he had been with Melanie. The two of them together had walked in the kitchen door of Liston's house, and Melanie had greeted her with her usual measured pleasantness, and Ada had known that William had said nothing to her. He was standing slightly behind Melanie, as if she were a shield he was putting forth between himself and Ada. Hey, he said, but he did not meet her gaze. Hey, said Ada, and then they had left the room, and that was all. The only difference was that Ada no longer spent any time with him or with Melanie and her friends. She didn't join them when they watched television in the den. She didn't ever go out in a group with Janice and Teresa and William's friends. She stayed in her room when Melanie was over at school. She made new friends, and she refocused her attention on Lisa Grady, who charitably allowed Ada back into her graces. By then, it had been nearly 2 months since she had seen her father. In that time, she had developed a dull, enduring ache that replaced David's physical presence in her life. She awoke from terrible nightmares, sweating and cold at once, in which she found he had in which she found he had died, that she was too late to see him one more time. Sometimes she imagined telling him that she loved him and there was no one she loved better. Other times she imagined shouting at him, hollering at the top of her lungs that he had betrayed her. At school, she was distracted. Avoiding him was by far worse than seeing him, and yet she did not go to him. Liston did not press her. It's your choice, she said simply. On Christmas Day, she had stayed in her room for most of the day, tormented, remembering all of the Christmases she had ever spent with David. It was his favorite holiday. It was not so many years before she had thought that David had been well enough to host a Christmas party at the lab, to write a play for all of them. She recalled him as he had looked, beckoning her up before the audience. She recalled her own humiliation. A Christmas play, he had announced, delighted, vibrant, alive. She would have given anything to be back inside that moment. She could not face him now. Liston went to visit him at St. Andrews still once or twice a week, but they did not speak about him when she returned. Ada never asked how David was doing, and Liston never told her. In mid-January, at Widener Library, Ada found the article they had been searching for. It came from the October 19th, 1950 edition of the Washington Times-Herald. Wrecked car found in Shenandoah. Driver missing, presumed dead, read the headline. The author of the story was Henry Fell, an oddity that would implant itself forever in Ada's memory because of the coincidence of the reporter's name, the image it conjured of some final plunge. The car, a beige 1947 Chrysler Windsor coupe, was found upside down in the river. Its windows rolled down. There were burnt rubber tracks on the rural Virginia bridge that spanned the space above. They matched the tires on the coupe. The theory put forth by the police was that the driver had been thrown into the river from the car, either during the skid or during the fall, and that his body would be recovered later. The car, wrote Fell, belonged to one Harold Kennedy, 32, unmarried, childless, a resident of Washington and an employee of the State Department. His parents in Kansas had been informed already of his probable death. Whether the incident was intentional or accidental, Bell did not speculate, nor did he mention what Kennedy might have been doing in rural Virginia in the early hours of the morning when the incident supposedly took place. At the bottom of the story, there was a small, somewhat blurry image of the victim with a caption beneath, Harold Kennedy, 32. Liston and Gregory were there next to her, each scanning the newspaper from a different year. Maddie was at a table nearby, reading a comic book, pretending to do his homework. Ada did not want to tell any of them yet. Instead, she sat in front of the microfilm reader, studying the article, studying the picture for signs of David. The man in the picture had a full head of dark hair, and he wore round tortoiseshell eyeglasses that particularly obscured his eyebrows. He wore a suit that looked nothing like any suit that David she knew would wear, but he was smiling slightly. She could not help but think that he looked like a man with a secret. And it was David's smile, in his cheekbones, his nose, his mouth. Ada could see her father. Yes, she felt certain that was David. She sat for a while longer alone with him, and then at last she called the rest of them over. Look, she said. Liston put a hand on her shoulder. David, she said, unswervingly. So they spent the next several weeks looking through every local paper for any further mention of the incident. They found none. With the help of Miss Holmes, they contacted the Washington, D.C. Department of Health, which maintained the vital records of the area. A death certificate for Harold Kennedy had not been issued for another 7 years in accordance with federal law, and then he had been declared dead in absentia. His worldly goods had presumably gone to his parents. They contacted the State Department to inquire about his work for them and were given the vague answer that he had worked in security from 1940 to 1950. The information was jarring. She could not imagine her father, David, skeptical of the government, skeptical of bureaucracy, working for the state. The question then was what happened between Harold Kennedy's death in 1950 and David's arrival at the BIT as a graduate student in 1951. The best person to ask for further details would have been President Pierce, but President Pierce was dead. There were so many more questions than answers. Why choose such a prominent family as the Sibeliuses? If David was going to make up a backstory, why choose the BIT? Why Boston? There was the problem of age, too. Kennedy had been born in 1918, and David always said he had been born in 1925, which meant if they were the same man, that David had shaved 7 years off his biological age, and suddenly there was a new context for his illness. He's not doing well, baby, said Liston. They were in the kitchen. It was a Sunday. It was February. Liston had just come home from visiting David. I thought you should know, she said. St. Andrews was decorated for Valentine's Day. Construction paper valentines hung in the large picture windows facing the parking lot. Red garlands curled around the columns that supported the portico. Inside, a bunch of red roses sat in a vase on the front desk. She should have brought flowers, Ada thought. Cut flowers were something that David loved having nearby. She felt a tumbling in her stomach. She felt that she was going to see a stranger. She had not seen him since November. Now, walking down the long hallways, past the desk attendant, past several nurses who recognized her warmly from months prior, she was afraid. There were new parents whom she did not recognize, and other names that had disappeared from the placards on each door. Liston had warned her again that David had declined, even more than Ada would expect. She said, he won't recognize you, baby, said Liston. He doesn't ever recognize me now. Liston put a hand on Ada's shoulder before they got to David's doorway. The door was open, only a crack. Liston raised the back of her hands to it and knocked. Once, twice. David? She said loudly. And then she pushed the door open by its handle and walked first into the room. Hi, David, said Liston brightly, and Ada followed behind until she saw her father. There he was, thin, very pale. His cheeks had collapsed in on themselves. The bones of them were showing sharply now. He was lying on his back in his bed. He wasn't in his blue armchair. His roommate was not in the room. His cheeks were hollow. He had aged 10 years in one. He shifted his eyes toward them without moving any other part of himself in their direction. His eyes, at least, were the same, light and forceful. Happy Valentine's Day, honey, said Liston, leaning over him. She was wearing her overcoat and hat. She took her hat off quickly, as if to help David recognize her. She combed her hair with her fingers. It's me. It's Liston. Ada stood behind her, frozen. This was not her father, not her tall, strong, agile father. Not David, who once moved as if he had springs in his joint, a hummingbird's heart. David's hands were folded on his stomach. He lifted one of them to his face and touched it. Once, twice, with a finger. Then he lowered it again. Do you want to sit up, honey? Asked Liston. Ada's here too, your daughter, Ada. She put an arm under his shoulders and helped him to maneuver upright to a seated position. With effort, she swiveled his legs off the bed and onto the floor. That's better, she said. Now you can chat with Ada. But Ada did not know what to say. She and David regarded one another, and Liston looked back and forth between them for several beats. I'm going to get some tea, she announced finally. Do you want anything? Liston was gone. The room was quiet. Ada worried for several moments that David was going to fall back on the bed. He wavered slightly, as if the muscles of his abdomen might not hold him adequately upright. But at last he put a hand down beside him on the bed, and he crossed one leg over the other. Ada saw that in his other hand he was clutching his lucky clover charm, the same one he'd been carrying about with him in his pocket for years. And then he looked for the first time more like himself. Hi, David, she said. He didn't reply. She eyed the blue armchair, but it was too far away. She pushed it toward him. She sat down on it, facing him, and then they were at eye level. Tell me a story, she wanted to say to him. Teach me something. They remained for a while like that, each looking into the eyes of the other, and Ada imagined beyond his eyes his skull, and beyond his skull his brain, the beating, pulsing organ that had once been his most powerful tool. Now slowing, synapses firing at random or incorrectly, memories receding, language receding, sleep overtaking wakefulness. She looked for her father, but she could not find him. Someone else was there in David's place. A ghost. Again, he put a hand to his face as if in surprise, as if in lamentation over the loss of all his words. Where had they gone? He closed his eyes slowly and kept them closed. This was not David. Hi, Harold, Ada said finally, and he opened his eyes. Hello, he said, his voice thick with disuse. He cleared his throat as if to make himself better understood. Again, he said it. Hello. Oh, thank you again, Jerry. Sugar. She waited until he fell asleep before leaving St. Andrews that day. When he did, she took out of his right hand the lucky clover charm he had been clutching tightly, wanting somehow to release the tension in his knuckles, and as she took it, she noticed a rattling sound to it that she had never before registered. She held it, looked at it. It was a green metal clover, its paint worn away by David's constant grip. It had 4 bifurcated leaves and a stem of different muted green. She shook it. Again, the rattle. There was a seam between the stem and the body. She pulled downward at the stem. Nothing happened. She pushed the stem inward, and after a little click, something released. The stem slid smoothly outward, a tiny drawer, and inside it was a miniature key, something that would fit inside the lock on a filing cabinet, she thought. 2009, San Francisco Boston. So maybe both in 2009? Are you busy? I hope I'm not disturbing you at work, said Gregory Liston on the phone. His voice was warm and familiar. It brought to her sharply a memory of Liston's house. He sounded older, somehow tired, but his voice still had a catch in it that he had never quite lost. It's okay, said Ada. No, I'm not busy. She pressed her fingers to her forehead, squeezed. Are you all right? She asked, finally, when he didn't continue. Listen, I have a question for you, said Gregory. It had been 5 years since the last time they'd spoken. He was in San Francisco, he said. He was there on a work trip. Gregory had studied mechanical engineering in grad school. Now he too worked in tech for a robotics firm based in Houston, but he lived in Boston still with his wife, Catherine, working remotely from an office space downtown, commuting twice a month to be on site. He was rich now. His sister, Joni, who kept Ada apprised of the family's comings and goings, had said so. Ada tried to picture him as he spoke. There was something strange in his voice, something he wanted to share with her. She could read him still, despite how fully they had fallen out of touch. She recognized from their youth the quality in his voice that indicated he was nervous and excited. This will sound strange, said Gregory, but were you ever able to decrypt the letters on the disk David left you? All those letters in a row, he said. She paused, took a breath. Always the sound of her father's name produced a response in her that was nearly physical. She heard it, she spoke it so rarely now. There were so few people in the world who would understand him, what he had meant to her, what he had left her with. No, she said, I never have. In fact, she had stopped trying to break it several years before. She had still had in her possession, someplace in the supply closet in her apartment in San Francisco, two of the copies of it that she had created along the way. But the original had been lost years ago when Ada was in college. One winter break, she had reached up to the top shelf in her closet at Liston's house to take down the dictionary in which she kept the several documents she had that related to David, including the 4 Ada floppy disk he had given her. But her hands had come away empty. Liston, when asked, speculated that she must have donated it during one of her rare organizational frenzies, mistaking it for something commonplace, not bothering to flip through the pages to verify its emptiness. God, I'm so sorry, baby, Liston had said, though of course it wasn't her fault, and Ada told her not to worry. Feigning nonchalance, smiling brightly to show her that it was only an object. The truth was, though, that it had acquired a significance in Ada's mind that was larger than she admitted, as the last thing that David ever gave her, even if she never solved the puzzle on it, the disc itself, had become a totem, a talisman, proof of her father's good intentions. Ada had continued after that to work on the copies of the disc that she had made, and from the text of the code itself, which she had long ago memorized. But the code, as far as she could tell, was unbreakable. After years and years of concentrated work, she had still not been able to decrypt it, nor had anyone. She had repeated the string of letters to anyone she thought might have an idea. The former members of the Steiner lab, Liston, Charles Robert, Hayato, and Frank, had all worked steadily at it throughout the last 20 years to no avail. She had even posted it in online forums anonymously, once offering a reward for anyone who could offer a persuasive decryption. At last, one day, Ada had decided, sadly, that Hayato's initial question, when she first showed the Steiner lab the string of letters David had left for her to decode, had been the correct one to ask. Was it possible that David's thoughts were already addled when he created the disc? And in that moment, she decided that she would try to put the disc out of her mind. On the other end of the telephone, Gregory was quiet. Her heart quickened. Before she could reply, Meredith Kranz appeared, hovering, uncertain, in the open doorway to her office. She made small movements with her hands. She was mouthing something to Ada. Hang on, Ada said into the phone, and she tilted it downward, away from her mouth. I'm sorry to interrupt, said Meredith. I was just wondering if I could borrow you for 2 seconds before the meeting. I have some questions. She crossed one leg in front of the other. She looked hesitant and small. Ada paused. She understood abruptly that it had not been Meredith's idea to do the pitch, that this was another of Billhoff's foolhardy, impulsive decisions. She breathed in and out once, deeply. Sure, she said to Meredith, 5 minutes, holding her right hand up, fingers spread. Thank you, whispered Meredith, her face awash in relief, and she continued to say thank you as she backed out of the door. Ada returned to the call. I've never solved it, she said again. It's been about 5 years since I tried, she added. Gregory was silent. Why, she asked. Because I was thinking I might have an idea, he said. They would meet, they decided, that morning. There was nothing keeping Ada at the office. She would give Meredith a brief and inadequate tutorial, answer her questions as simply as she could, and send her off. Then she would leave for the day. Maybe, thought Ada, she would leave for good. The last time she had seen Gregory Liston was in 2004. It was also the last time she had been to Boston. It was for Diana Liston's funeral. Ada had known it was coming for much of the 90s. Liston had fought against reoccurrence after reoccurrence of breast cancer, which culminated in a terminal diagnosis in 2003. But it did not lessen the blow of the words as they had been spoken to her by Joni Liston over the phone. I'm so sorry, Ada had replied, and it was only after hanging up that she had allowed herself to collapse into violent convulsive sobs, the kind of weeping in which she had only ever let herself indulge. Truthfully, in the presence of Liston herself, she retched, she cried so much in those first days, and so often, that she had to remind herself to drink water, to stay hydrated. She wished for a friend, a companion, someone she could share her grief with. She wished for Liston, whom she had called frequently throughout her adult life to seek advice or comfort. She had been casually dating someone in those days, meeting up once or twice a week with a kind of non-committal programmer named Gabe, but Gabe did not seem to her to be the person with whom to share this kind of sorrow. Her other friends in San Francisco both did and did not understand. They couldn't place Liston in Ada's life in terms that they could relate to. She fit no category neatly. Liston was not Ada's mother. She was not even Ada's relative. A close family friend was how Ada referred to Liston. Still, though, it never felt right. Or sometimes I lived with her in high school. Only Liston's children might truly understand, but they themselves were busy, and it felt wrong to Ada to seek comfort from them. Joni had taken the lead on the funeral arrangements, and she was keeping Ada informed, but separate. Don't be silly, she said to Ada, trying to be kind, when Ada asked what she could do to help. But I want to, Ada had thought. I want to help. That whole week, she had tiptoed around the edges of the Liston clan, seeking a place for herself, finding it difficult. She was 33 that year and had left Boston at 18. She had come home only for some summers and holidays until she was 22, and then rarely after that. At the wake, she had stood to the side in Liston's living room on Shawmut Way, fighting back tears. The house was packed, absurd hot. There was Maddie holding court in the middle of a group of childhood friends, now tall men, some of whom Ada vaguely remembered. There was William, who had expanded over the years into a benevolent, sleepy 35-year-old, already twice married and twice divorced. His daughter, Abigail, 6 or 7, stood next to him as golden and gorgeous as he had been as a child. There was Joni with her own brood. There was Gregory, then an engineer in Boston, who had, despite all odds, become a reasonable, functional adult. He could even have been called well-adjusted. He had lost the shyness he had had as a child, when his expression typically vacillated between embarrassment and devastation. It had been replaced instead by a quiet seriousness that made room frequently for flashes of wit. He had surprised Ada on several occasions in her adulthood by producing, as if from nowhere, the exact brand of humor that reduced her to helplessness. Silly laughter, the absurd humor that David, in fact, had favored. In these moments, she looked at Gregory in surprise. Where was this when you were a child? It would have helped him, she thought. In the crowded living room that day, he stood next to his wife, Catherine. Ada had been invited to their wedding 4 years prior and had gone, bringing her grad school boyfriend, Jim. Catherine was tall, taller than Gregory, and waspy in some unquantifiable way, forthright and assured of her own correctness. Maybe she was beautiful. Ada had done a double take the first time they had met and manifested both intelligence and kindness, but she had spent her wedding weekend ordering Gregory around in a way that was so obvious as to be uncomfortable. Ada had one picture of herself and Jim from that weekend. It was shortly before the total collapse of their relationship, and in it, Catherine's long arm could be seen outstretched in the background, presumably pointing Gregory towards something that needed to be done. Now, at Liston's wake, Catherine was silent while next to her, Gregory spoke with guests and received their condolences. From time to time, she checked her phone suddenly. The rest of the house was filled with Liston's girlfriends from high school who knew how to help Joni without being asked, and with Liston's relatives, cousins and aunts and uncles, whom Ada had met several times a year in high school. All of them looked at her with vague recognition and then surprise. Ada, they said, so good to see you. But it was Gregory and Maddie and William whom they embraced firmly, whom they collared and held tight. It was Joni to whom they said she was incredible. The Steiner lab had come, of course, and Ada stood and talked for a time to Hayato, who himself was holding back tears. After David, out of all the members of the lab, he and Liston had been closest, but all of them left early, much earlier than Liston's extended family. Raucous Irish Bostonians who would stay, Ada knew, until the early hours of the morning, singing Liston's favorite song, The Parting Glass, the Clancy Brothers version, encouraging everyone to join in. Ada, too, stayed. She felt she should be there. It felt like asserting something about her life and the importance of Liston in it. But she found that in Liston's absence, there was no one there to bring her into the center of things, no one to proudly introduce her to the room. Toward the end, Gregory, with Catherine on the opposite side of the room, had approached Ada. He was drunk, maybe. His face was slightly pink, his gaze sentimental. Mom loved you so much, he said to her. Sometimes I thought she loved you better than she loved us. Ada laughed. She shook her head. You were better behaved than we were, said Gregory. That's for sure. She just didn't catch me, said Ada. But of course he was right. And David, said Gregory. He hung his head. I think she was in love with David for half her life. Ada tensed. No, said Ada. No, they were friends. You didn't see what we saw, said Gregory. Before he got sick, she mooned over him. She confessed it to Joni when Joni got older. If he liked women, I think they could have been a great love story. They made sense together. Oh, I don't know about that, she said vaguely. I don't think she was. She searched the room for an escape. David had been gone for 20 years now, and still his name now produced in her something akin to pain. She loved her father, still loved him, but it elicited a deep, dull ache in her to think of him, to speak of him. There were too many unresolved questions about him. Over the years, Ada's vision of David had become something delicate and tense, a raveled knot of emotion that twisted tighter at any mention of him. I do, said Gregory. My brothers and sister and I talked about it all the time. We teased her about it. She smiled ruefully. Well, she said she could think of nothing more to say. But Gregory was not finished. You were both like that, he said. You Sibeliuses. His voice had taken on an edge, and Ada could not identify its source. She searched his face. He looked away. Like what? She wanted to ask, but she felt it was a door that she should not open. I better get going, she said. She lifted her purse onto her shoulder. Awkwardly, she had hugged Gregory, Maddie, Catherine, the rest of them, even William. She had said goodbye to Charlotte Way, to the houses on it, first Liston's house, into which Gregory and his new wife, Catherine, would move that same year, and then David's, which had recently been acquired by its third set of owners since she and Liston had sold it. At last, in 1987, Liston had kept her apprised of its state from across the country whenever they spoke. The Burkes have it planted nicely, she told Ada, or this new family needs to get someone to mow the lawn. Ada would miss those reports. Finally, she had gone back to her hotel. She hadn't slept. She had lain awake until the sun rose and then boarded the plane that took her back to San Francisco. That was 5 years ago. Since then, she had exchanged sporadic, half-hearted emails with Maddie, now Matt, a serial dater, a perennial youngest child, who hopped between jobs and girlfriends with equal enthusiasm, had exchanged Facebook likes and messages with Joni, who texted her photographs of her children. Kenny, the oldest, would be a father himself soon, and complaints about what terrible things Catherine was doing to Liston's house. You'd hate it, Joni had written confidently. It looks like a beach house or something, white wicker everywhere. Though she had settled into an amicable relationship with William, she still kept her distance from him. They had nothing in common, Ada realized, and they never had. Every so often she sent a line to Gregory, to whom she had been closest as a child, but his replies to her were typically brief, and so after a while she ceased to. There was nothing keeping her at the office now. Meredith, after all, was leading the meeting. She put on her jacket, stood up, and walked across the main floor. Strange looks from her colleagues, from Tom Cien, and then out the door and into her car. She had suggested to Gregory a restaurant called Larkspur, avoiding Palo Alto's most popular spots. It was a sort of tea room, some place that served breakfast and lunch, some place she hadn't tried before, some place she thought where she wouldn't be seen by anyone she knew. She didn't want to have to introduce Gregory to anyone or explain what they were doing. As she drove, she contemplated David. He existed in a deep recess of her mind as a strange and painful chapter of her own history that she only thought about when she was prepared for sadness. She tried to convince herself that she had come to terms with him, that she was comfortable at last with never knowing the truth about him, but she was not certain she had been successful in this endeavor. He was troubled. This was how she had categorized him, the word she used to describe him, always to friends. She still had dreams about him, though, regularly, once a week or more, and in them he appeared to her as the base of all benevolence in the universe, a kind and somehow holy presence that blessed and pacified her, that eased her worry, that calmed her. She woke up from these dreams consoled, but any warm feelings she had were quickly replaced with suspicion, with the unsettling sensation of being lied to again and again, even by her own recollections. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. You pick it up there tomorrow on page I'm sorry, 337 here. I'm just showing what's left because it's quite a bit. And the what I just read, it felt very much like an ending, like wrapping up, "Oh, this happened to this person and this happened to this," at that point, it may go on further, like, later years than here anyway. Like, obviously, there's a lot more to the story, and there's obviously we don't even know what the whole deal with David. We have some more pieces today, but that's very interesting. So, they were able to find the photo of the Harold Kennedy and match that that's David, so it was Harold Kennedy, he was still alive, didn't die, and there is some connection, right? Like, Terry was like, "Black ops," like, but he did work for the State Department, so there's gotta be something similar there. Um, and yeah, we got a lot more on like kind of what happened with Liston, breast cancer, what like, and that was pretty quick in that chapter there, gave a lot of information. Um, Nobody likes Catherine, Gregory's wife, whatever. All right, I have to pee. Um, so we'll pick it up there tomorrow. Oh, it was a long day, but pretty productive. I did get things done, so that's good. I gotta feed myself. I gotta feed my mutt. I gotta pee. I gotta kiss you. Good night. I love you. And put this in the donate bin.